The invitation that changed everything. The rain tapped a rhythmic pattern against the small kitchen window of Julia's studio apartment. She sat at the rickety table she had salvaged from a thrift store, the dim light overhead casting long shadows on the walls. Her fingers hovered over the thick envelope resting before her, the Carmichael family crest glinting in the low light. For a moment, she questioned whether to even open it. 2 years ago, she had walked away from the Carmichaels with nothing but her pride intact, and even that had been a fragile thing. Her marriage to Eric Carmichael, heir to one of the wealthiest families in the city, had been a whirlwind of romance and deceit. What had started as an intoxicating dream had turned into a waking nightmare. Eric, with his effortless charm and promises of forever, had pulled her into his glittering world only to cast her out when she no longer fit the mold he desired. A schoolteacher from humble beginnings, Julia had never been truly accepted by his family. To them, she was an outsider, a distraction, a mistake. Eric's betrayal came swiftly and without warning. One evening, he came home late, his cologne laced with the scent of someone else, and announced he was leaving her. The divorce was a formality orchestrated by the Carmichael family's army of lawyers. They ensured she walked away with nothing. No assets, no alimony, not even the dignity of a fair fight. Julia moved into a rundown studio apartment and picked up every side gig she could find to stay afloat. Nights were spent grading papers, her empty stomach gnawing at her resolve, but she refused to crumble. Now, sitting at her kitchen table, the unexpected envelope before her felt like a cruel joke. Why would the Carmichaels contact her? The obituary she had skimmed in the paper earlier that week flashed in her mind. Richard Carmichael, patriarch of the Carmichael Empire, passed away peacefully at the age of 78. Richard had been an enigmatic presence during her marriage. Stern but not unkind, he often watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read, like he was evaluating her worth. Curiosity overcame her hesitation. She slid a finger under the seal and pulled out the thick parchment. The words stared back at her like an accusation. You are hereby invited to the reading of the last will and testament of Richard Carmichael, to take place at the Carmichael estate, Saturday at noon. Julia's heart sank. Why would they include her in this? The thought of facing Eric and his family again was almost unbearable. Yet, as the hours ticked by, she found herself unable to shake the invitation's hold on her. She had spent years as a bystander to the Carmichael dynasty, a pawn in their games. Perhaps this was her chance to reclaim a sliver of dignity. Saturday came, gray and unrelenting. The drive to the Carmichael estate felt surreal. The grand mansion emerged through the mist like a fortress, its marble columns and iron gates a stark contrast to the modest life she now led. Julia parked her aging sedan at the edge of the driveway, the engine sputtering to a stop. She sat in silence for a moment, her hands gripping the wheel as nerves threatened to undo her. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself why she was here. The butler greeted her at the door with the same cold formality she remembered. "This way, Miss Julia," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes lingering on her scuffed shoes and worn coat. The familiar scent of polished wood and fresh flowers filled her senses as she stepped inside. Memories surged. Dinners where her opinions were dismissed, events where she was made to feel invisible. Not today. The study where the will was to be read was already crowded. The air buzzed with whispered conversations that fell silent as she entered. All eyes turned to her, some shocked, others outright hostile. Eric stood by the window, his arm draped casually around Cassandra, the woman he had left her for. Cassandra's designer dress clung to her like a second skin, her sharp smile a testament to her triumph over Julia. For a moment, Julia faltered, but she forced herself to meet Eric's gaze. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I was invited," Julia replied, holding up the envelope. Her tone was calm, though her heart raced. Cassandra let out a soft, condescending laugh. "This is a private family matter. Surely there's been a mistake." Before Julia could respond, the lawyer entered, a composed man with a no-nonsense air. "Mrs. Julia Carmichael is here because she is listed as a beneficiary in Mr. Richard Carmichael's will." The room erupted into chaos. Eric's face turned a mottled shade of red as he sputtered protests, while Cassandra looked as if she'd been slapped. Whispers rippled through the crowd, accusations flying faster than Julia could process them. Yet, amid the commotion, Julia stood silently, her head held high. "Let them seethe." The lawyer raised a hand, commanding silence. "The terms of Mr. Carmichael's will are legally binding. Any disputes can be taken to court, though I assure you, Mr. Carmichael was meticulous in his preparations." Eric stepped forward, his anger palpable. "This is absurd. She's not family. She has no claim to anything." "Your father disagreed," the lawyer replied coolly. He opened a leather folder and began reading aloud. The room fell silent once more as the list of beneficiaries was announced. Julia barely heard the words at first, her mind spinning. But when her name was read, accompanied by the declaration that she was to inherit something substantial, her breath caught. "To Julia Carmichael, I leave the Carmichael Vineyard estate and all associated assets." The vineyard, the crown jewel of the Carmichael empire. Julia's knees nearly buckled. The gasps and outraged murmurs around her confirmed that this was no minor inheritance. The vineyard was legendary, its wines lauded across the country, its value immeasurable. Why would Richard give it to her? Eric's fury boiled over. This is a joke. She can't possibly manage a vineyard. She's a schoolteacher. His tone was dripping with contempt. "Your father's wishes are clear," the lawyer interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "The vineyard is now Julia Carmichael's. If you wish to contest it, I suggest you prepare for a lengthy and costly legal battle." Eric's glare burned into Julia, but she refused to flinch. She had faced worse storms than his temper. As the family dispersed, muttering their grievances, Julia remained in the study, clutching the copy of the will the lawyer had handed her. The reality of her new life was just beginning to sink in. Driving away from the mansion that evening, Julia's emotions swung between triumph and bewilderment. She couldn't shake the image of Eric's face, twisted with disbelief. For years he had stripped her of everything, and now she held something he couldn't touch. Yet the mystery lingered. Why had Richard chosen her? What had he seen in her that even she couldn't see in herself? As her car climbed the winding road toward the vineyard, she resolved to find the answers. Whatever the future held, one thing was certain. Julia Carmichael was no longer the woman they had dismissed and discarded. A vineyard of secrets. The morning sun rose hesitantly, casting golden light across the endless rows of grapevines. Julia's sedan crawled up the vineyard's winding driveway, the uneven gravel crunching under its tires. She parked near the sprawling stone house at the estate's center. The property loomed before her, breathtaking and intimidating. She hesitated, her hands gripping the steering wheel, as she took in the vast landscape. "This is mine now," she reminded herself, though the thought felt surreal. The house itself stood like a sentinel, weathered but proud. Its stone facade was softened by ivy climbing its walls, and the roof's terracotta tiles glowed warmly in the morning light. Julia stepped out of the car, adjusting her coat against the crisp breeze. The vineyard stretched as far as the eye could see, blanketed in a delicate morning mist. Workers moved through the rows, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun. A man approached her from the house. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, and a weathered face that spoke of years spent under the sun. His gait was purposeful but unhurried, and his expression was one of cautious curiosity. "You must be Julia Carmichael," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Henry, the vineyard manager." Julia shook his hand, noting the rough calluses that came from a lifetime of hard work. "Yes, I'm Julia. It's good to meet you." Henry nodded, his sharp eyes studying her. "Mr. Carmichael spoke about you often." She blinked, surprised. "He did." Henry gave a small smile. "Not in detail, but he always said you were the only one in the family who treated people with kindness. He had a lot of respect for you." Julia felt her cheeks flush. Richard Carmichael, the stern patriarch who had barely acknowledged her during her marriage, had respected her. The idea was difficult to reconcile with her memories of him, cold, distant, and commanding. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "I didn't realize he thought that way." Henry motioned toward the house. "Why don't we step inside? There's something you should see." The interior of the house was grand but not ostentatious. The high ceilings and large windows filled the space with light, and the furniture was elegant but functional. It was a home meant for living, not just for show. A stark contrast to the Carmichael mansion, where every room felt like a museum exhibit. Henry led her to a study lined with bookshelves and filled with the faint scent of aged wood and leather. On the desk sat a small stack of letters, their envelopes addressed to her in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. "These arrived shortly before he passed," Henry explained. "He asked me to keep them safe and give them to you if you ever came here." Julia's heart skipped a beat. Slowly, she reached for the first envelope, the thick paper cool under her fingers. She unfolded the letter inside, Richard's elegant but slightly shaky handwriting staring back at her. "Dear Julia, if you're reading this, it means I've passed on, and you've been thrust into the chaos of the Carmichael family once again. For that, I apologize. But I needed to ensure you were taken care of, and this was the only way I knew how. You're probably wondering why I left the vineyard to you. The truth is, I admired you more than I ever let on. You were kind, patient, and loyal in ways my son never deserved. When Eric betrayed you, it broke something in me. I saw too much of myself in him, selfish, arrogant, blind to what truly matters. The vineyard was always meant to be a legacy of integrity and hard work, not just a source of wealth. I couldn't trust Eric to honor that, but I could trust you. You have the strength and character to make it thrive. I hope this gift brings you the stability and peace you deserve. Sincerely, Richard Carmichael." Tears blurred Julia's vision as she set the letter down. The words carried a weight she hadn't expected. For so long, she had felt invisible in the Carmichael world, dismissed and undervalued. Yet here was proof that Richard had seen her, had understood her struggles even when she thought he hadn't noticed. She picked up the next letter, eager to learn more. Each one revealed another layer of Richard's thoughts, his regrets as a father, his disappointment in Eric, and his hope that Julia would find happiness again. By the time she finished, she felt a mix of gratitude and sadness. "You all right?" Henry asked gently. Julia nodded, wiping her eyes. "I am. It's just a lot to take in." Henry gave her a moment before speaking again. "The vineyard's workers will have questions. Most of them have been here for years, and they're loyal to the property. Not to Eric or the rest of the family, but they'll need to know your plans." "My plans," Julia echoed. The enormity of the situation hit her. Owning the vineyard wasn't just a title, it was a responsibility. "Yes," Henry said. "Richard trusted you for a reason. If you want to honor that trust, you'll need to step into his role, not just as an owner, but as a leader." Julia took a deep breath. "Then I'd better start learning how to do that." Julia spent the rest of the day touring the property with Henry. The vineyard was a world unto itself, its rhythms dictated by the seasons and the land. Henry introduced her to the workers, a mix of seasoned hands and younger apprentices, all of whom eyed her with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. As they walked among the rows of grapevines, Henry explained the vineyard's operations. He spoke of the delicate balance required to produce their award-winning wines, the challenges of weather and pests, and the meticulous care each vine required. Julia listened intently, absorbing as much as she could. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Julia felt both exhilarated and overwhelmed. The vineyard was beautiful, but it was also a monumental responsibility. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a role she wasn't prepared for. That evening, she sat alone in the study, the letters spread out before her. The weight of Richard's trust pressed heavily on her. Could she really do this? Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. The caller ID flashed Eric's name. Her stomach tightened, but she answered, her voice steady. "What do you want?" Eric's tone was sharp. "We need to talk. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." "I know exactly what I've gotten into," Julia replied. "And if you're calling to intimidate me, don't bother." Eric let out a bitter laugh. "This isn't intimidation. It's reality. That vineyard is more than you can handle. You're a school teacher, Julia. You're in over your head." "Maybe I am," she admitted. "But that's my problem, not yours." "Don't be stupid," he snapped. "Sell the vineyard to me. You'll make more money than you've ever dreamed of, and you won't have to deal with the mess." Julia's grip on the phone tightened. "No, Richard trusted me with the vineyard, and I'm going to honor that trust. You can't bully me into selling." Eric's voice turned cold. "You'll regret this." "Goodbye, Eric," Julia said firmly, ending the call. She placed the phone on the desk and leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she had stood up to Eric. And for the first time, she felt like she was finally reclaiming her life. As she gazed out the window at the vineyard bathed in moonlight, a sense of determination settled over her. The road ahead would be difficult, but she had already survived worse. If Richard had believed in her, then she owed it to both him and herself to rise to the challenge. Roots of resilience. The morning light streamed through the large windows of the vineyard's main house, casting warm patterns on the hardwood floors. Julia stood in the kitchen, staring at the steaming cup of coffee in her hands. She hadn't slept well. The weight of the vineyard, Richard's trust, and Eric's simmering resentment felt heavy on her shoulders. Yet, as daunting as it all seemed, a spark of determination flickered within her. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. Julia placed the mug on the counter and opened the door to find Henry standing there, his expression as stoic as ever. "Morning," he greeted. "You ready for today?" She nodded, trying to project confidence. "What's on the agenda?" "Harvest season prep," Henry said, stepping inside. "We'll be walking the fields, checking the vines, and coordinating with the workers. It's the busiest time of the year, and there's a lot to manage." Julia grabbed a notebook and pen from the counter. "I'm ready." Henry raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment. Instead, he led her out to the fields, the cool morning air carrying the faint scent of soil and grapes. The weight of the land. The vineyard stretched endlessly, rows upon rows of grapevines basking in the soft morning light. Henry explained the delicate process of preparing for harvest, the careful timing required to pick the grapes at peak ripeness, the labor-intensive work of sorting and processing, and the ever-present threat of weather that could ruin months of effort in a single storm. As they walked, workers greeted Henry with nods of respect, their eyes flicking curiously to Julia. She noticed how each person moved with purpose, their hands rough from years of toil. This was a world built on hard work and precision, and she felt an acute sense of her own inexperience. "These people are the backbone of the vineyard," Henry said, sensing her thoughts. "They've been here longer than I have. Some of their families have worked here for generations." Julia stopped to watch a group of workers tending to the vines. One of them, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, smiled and gave her a small wave. Julia returned it, feeling an unexpected warmth. "I want to meet them all," Julia said. "I need to understand what they do, what they need. If I'm going to lead this place, I have to earn their trust." Henry's lips curved into a faint smile. "That's a good start. Richard would have liked that." Echoes of the past. By midday, Julia was exhausted. The sheer volume of information Henry had shared about the vineyard was overwhelming. Yet she refused to let her fatigue show. After a quick lunch, they returned to the house to review the vineyard's records. Julia sat at the large desk in the study, surrounded by stacks of ledgers and reports, detailing everything from production costs to market trends. As she sifted through the documents, a pattern began to emerge. The vineyard had been struggling financially in recent years. Richard had poured resources into maintaining its quality, but declining wine sales and rising operational costs had taken their toll. Julia felt a pang of anxiety. Could she really turn this around? Amid the stacks of papers, she found a leather-bound journal with Richard's name embossed on the cover. She hesitated before opening it, unsure if she was ready to confront his unfiltered thoughts. But curiosity won out. July 12, 2 years ago. Eric has always been my greatest disappointment. His ambition is hollow, driven by greed rather than purpose. When he divorced Julia, I realized just how blind I had been to his flaws. She didn't deserve the way he treated her. Julia has a quiet strength that I come to admire. I see in her what I once saw in myself, a will to persevere, even when the odds are against her. The vineyard deserves a steward with integrity. I can't let Eric destroy it. Julia closed the journal, her chest tight. Richard's words were both a validation and a burden. He had placed his faith in her, believing she could save the vineyard from Eric's destructive influence. She wasn't sure if she could live up to his expectations, but she knew she had to try. A brewing storm. As the days turned into weeks, Julia threw herself into the work of managing the vineyard. She spent hours in the fields with the workers, learning their names and listening to their stories. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Slowly, the workers began to warm to her, their initial skepticism giving way to cautious optimism. Henry proved to be an invaluable ally. His decades of experience were a steady guide, and his quiet encouragement gave her confidence. Together, they developed a plan to address the vineyard's financial struggles, focusing on marketing the vineyard's legacy and exploring new distribution channels. But not everyone was supportive. Word of Julia's growing influence reached Eric, who wasted no time in making his displeasure known. One afternoon, as Julia walked the rows of vines, she spotted Eric's sleek car parked near the main house. Her heart sank. She had hoped he would leave her alone, but his presence was a reminder that the battle for the vineyard was far from over. She found him in the study, pacing like a caged animal. When he saw her, his expression hardened. "Julia," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've had your fun playing landowner, but it's time to be realistic. This vineyard is too much for you." Julia crossed her arms, refusing to be intimidated. "What do you want, Eric?" He smirked. "To make you an offer. Sell me the vineyard. You'll walk away with more money than you've ever seen, and you won't have to deal with the headache of running this place." Julia's jaw tightened. "I'm not selling." Eric's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. "Don't be stupid. You don't know what you're doing, and this vineyard will collapse under your watch." "Then that's my risk to take," Julia said firmly. "Richard trusted me to manage this place, and I'm going to honor that trust." Eric stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "You'll regret this." Julia held her ground. "The only thing I regret is wasting years of my life with you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Eric glared at her for a long moment before storming out. As his car roared down the driveway, Julia felt a mix of fear and triumph. She knew he wouldn't give up easily, but she also knew she couldn't let him win. Planting new seeds. That evening, Julia sat on the balcony of the main house, a glass of wine in hand. The vineyard stretched before her, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The challenges ahead were daunting, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose. Richard's trust in her wasn't just a gift, it was a call to action. She would fight for the vineyard, for the people who worked there, and for herself. She had been left with nothing before, but now she had something worth fighting for. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Julia made a silent promise to herself. "I will honor this legacy, no matter what it takes." The winds of change. The vineyard was alive with motion, a hive of activity as preparations for harvest began in earnest. The workers moved through the rows of grapevines with a practiced rhythm, their tools glinting in the sunlight. Julia stood on the porch of the main house, sipping her coffee and watching the scene unfold. For the first time, She felt a tentative sense of belonging here. The vineyard, with its rich history and endless potential, was no longer just a gift. It was her responsibility. Yet, that morning brought with it more than the usual hum of labor. A commotion near the main gate drew her attention. A sleek black SUV pulled up, its glossy exterior reflecting the sun's harsh glare. Julia set down her coffee, a sense of unease creeping over her. "Henry," she called, stepping off the porch as the vehicle came to a stop. The vineyard manager appeared from the side of the house, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression darkened when he saw the SUV. The door of the car opened, and a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out. His tailored suit and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to the dusty, hard-working atmosphere of the vineyard. He adjusted his tie before approaching Julia with an air of arrogance. "Miss Carmichael," he said, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. "My name is Thomas Greer. I'm representing your ex-husband, Eric Carmichael." Julia's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "What do you want, Mr. Greer?" Greer smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Eric has sent me to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. He believes this vineyard is too much for you to handle and is prepared to make you a generous offer to buy it." Henry bristled beside her. "This vineyard is hers now," he said, his voice firm. "Mr. Richard Carmichael made sure of that." Julia held up a hand to silence Henry. "I appreciate the concern," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not interested in selling. Richard trusted me to manage this vineyard, and I intend to do just that." Greer's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Ms. Carmichael, I must warn you. Eric is prepared to pursue legal action if necessary. The vineyard may have been left to you, but the Carmichael family has considerable resources, and they will challenge this inheritance in court." Julia crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "Then he can try. But I won't be intimidated into giving up what's rightfully mine." A growing resolve. After Greer left, Julia retreated to the study, her mind racing. She knew Eric wouldn't back down easily, and the thought of a drawn-out legal battle was daunting. Yet she also knew she couldn't let fear dictate her actions. Richard had chosen her for a reason, and she wouldn't dishonor his trust by folding under pressure. Henry found her later, poring over the vineyard's financial records. "You handled that well," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Julia sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't feel like I did. Eric won't stop until he gets what he wants." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe. But you've got something he doesn't. Integrity. The workers are starting to see that. They're behind you." His words gave her a glimmer of hope. Over the past few weeks, she had made a concerted effort to connect with the workers. She spent time in the fields, listened to their concerns, and made it clear that she valued their expertise. Slowly but surely, they had begun to accept her as more than just the unexpected new owner, a surprise ally. That evening, as Julia was finishing up her work, a knock on the door startled her. When she opened it, she found a woman standing on the porch, her sleek, tailored dress a sharp contrast to the vineyard's rustic surroundings. "Julia Carmichael," the woman asked, extending a hand. "I'm Clara Preston. I was Richard's attorney." Julia hesitated before shaking her hand. "I thought the will was handled by the estate lawyer." Clara smiled faintly. "It was, but Richard asked me to reach out to you after his passing. He wanted me to provide some additional context about his decisions." Curiosity piqued, Julia invited Clara inside. They sat in the study, the crackle of the fireplace filling the silence as Clara pulled out a folder. "Richard was a complicated man," Clara began, "but he was also a meticulous one. He knew his family well, and he made very deliberate choices when it came to his will." Julia frowned. "Why would he choose me? I wasn't close to him." Clara opened the folder, revealing a collection of documents and photographs. "Richard saw something in you that he didn't see in his own family: integrity, resilience, and a genuine care for others. He respected that. He believed you had the strength to carry on the vineyard's legacy." She slid a photograph across the desk. It was an old picture of Richard standing in the vineyard, a rare smile on his face. Beside him was a young worker Julia recognized as one of the foremen who still worked there. He spent more time here in his later years than most people realized, Clara continued. He saw how the family treated the vineyard as nothing more than a status symbol. He wanted to ensure it was left in the hands of someone who would honor its legacy. Julia's throat tightened. She had always thought of Richard as distant and cold, but these revelations painted him in a different light. "Thank you for telling me this," she said quietly. Clara smiled. "It was important to him that you knew. And if you ever need support, don't hesitate to reach out. Richard trusted you, and so do I." Strength and unity. The next morning, Julia gathered the workers in the main barn. They stood in a loose circle, their faces a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Julia took a deep breath before addressing them. "I know many of you were surprised when I inherited the vineyard," she began. "I was surprised too. But Richard believed in this place, and he believed in all of you. I want you to know that I'm committed to continuing his legacy." She paused, scanning the crowd. "I can't do this alone. I need your help. Your expertise, your passion, and your dedication are what make this vineyard thrive. Together, I believe we can overcome any challenge." The room was silent for a moment before one of the older workers, a man named Louis, stepped forward. "We've seen owners come and go," he said, his voice steady. "But you've shown us respect. You're not afraid to get your hands dirty. That means something." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Julia felt a swell of emotion. For the first time, she saw not just a group of workers, but a team, a family of sorts, united by a shared purpose. The first harvest. With the workers behind her, Julia threw herself into the preparations for harvest. She worked long hours in the fields, learning every aspect of the process. Henry and the foreman guided her, their patience and expertise invaluable. As the first crates of grapes were loaded onto the trucks, Julia felt a surge of pride. The vineyard was alive with energy, the culmination of months of hard work and collaboration. She stood with Henry on the porch, watching the trucks disappear down the driveway. "You did good," Henry said, clapping her on the shoulder. Julia smiled, her exhaustion overshadowed by a deep sense of fulfillment. "We all did." As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the vineyard in a golden glow, Julia realized something profound. This wasn't just about honoring Richard's legacy. It was about building her own. The battle for the vineyard. The weeks following the first successful harvest were a blur of activity for Julia. Trucks loaded with crates of grapes rolled out of the vineyard daily, destined for markets and wineries that had long admired the Carmichael Vineyard's reputation. Despite the early success, Julia knew the real challenge was just beginning. The vineyard's finances were still precarious, and the shadow of Eric's threat loomed large. One morning, Julia sat in the study poring over financial documents when Henry entered, his expression grim. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. Julia looked up, her stomach tightening. "What is it?" "Word's going around that Eric is meeting with some of our biggest distributors," Henry said. "He's trying to undercut us, offering them deals to stop working with us." Julia's hands clenched. It wasn't enough for Eric to threaten legal action. Now he was attacking the vineyard's lifeblood. "Do you think they'll take the bait?" Henry sighed. "Some might. The vineyard's reputation is strong, but Eric has deep pockets. He can afford to take losses just to hurt us." Julia's mind raced. She had spent weeks building trust with the workers and stabilizing operations, but without distributors, the vineyard couldn't survive. She needed a plan. The community connection. Julia's first instinct was to reach out to the distributors directly. She drafted a series of emails and scheduled calls with the most critical partners. Over the next few days, she worked tirelessly to reassure them of the vineyard's stability and quality. Some responded with encouragement, others with hesitation. One evening, after another round of difficult conversations, Julia received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was warm and familiar. "Julia, it's Marcia, the owner of a small but well-regarded wine shop in the city. I've been hearing some rumors about the vineyard. Is everything okay?" Julia hesitated. Marcia had always been a strong supporter of the Carmichael Vineyards wines, but she couldn't afford to lose her trust. "Eric is trying to interfere with our business," she admitted. "But I promise you, the vineyard is thriving. The quality of our grapes is as strong as ever." Marcia chuckled softly. "I've seen Eric's tactics before. He tried to pull the same stunt with another winery years ago. Don't worry, Julia. I trust you, and so do a lot of other small business owners. Let me make a few calls. Get the word out that the Carmichael Vineyard is still the real deal." Julia's chest tightened with gratitude. "Thank you, Marcia. That means so much." As the call ended, Julia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She couldn't rely solely on the old distribution channels. If Eric wanted to play dirty, she would outsmart him. Building a new network. The next morning, Julia gathered the workers and shared her plan. Instead of focusing solely on traditional distributors, they would expand into new markets. Local restaurants, independent wine shops, and even direct-to-consumer sales through online platforms would become their lifeline. Henry raised an eyebrow as she outlined her strategy. "That's a big shift," he said, "but it could work." "It has to," Julia replied. "We can't let Eric control our future." The workers responded with enthusiasm, eager to protect the vineyard they had poured their lives into. Over the following weeks, Julia worked with a local marketing firm to revamp the vineyard's branding. She also enlisted the help of younger workers who were tech-savvy, launching a social media campaign that showcased the vineyard's rich history and commitment to quality. The response was overwhelming. Orders began pouring in from local businesses and customers who wanted to support the vineyard. Julia spent long nights processing orders and coordinating deliveries, but the hard work was worth it. Eric's counterattack. Eric wasn't idle during this time. Julia received a notice from his lawyer, demanding that she attend a mediation meeting to discuss the ownership dispute. The wording made it clear that Eric had no intention of compromising. He wanted the vineyard, and he would stop at nothing to get it. Julia shared the letter with Clara Preston, Richard's attorney. "Clara, read it carefully, her sharp eyes scanning every line." "He's trying to rattle you," Clara said. "But the will is airtight." Richard made sure of that. "Can he drag this out in court?" Julia asked. Clara nodded. "Potentially. But it would be expensive, even for him. If you're willing to fight, I'll stand by you." Julia leaned back in her chair, her mind churning. She hated the idea of a prolonged legal battle, but she couldn't let Eric bully her into submission. A surprising revelation. As the vineyard's operation stabilized, Julia found herself with a moment to breathe. One afternoon, she revisited the letters Richard had written to her. She opened one she hadn't read before, the paper crinkling softly in her hands. "Dear Julia, if you're reading this, it means you've stepped into a role I never imagined for you. But I always hoped you would. The vineyard is more than just land and vines. It's a testament to resilience. My father built it with his bare hands, and I spent my life trying to honor that legacy. There's something you should know. When Eric was young, I made a mistake. I shielded him from the hard truths of life, thinking I was protecting him. Instead, I created a man who takes without earning, who believes the world owes him something. I failed him, and I failed you by not stepping in sooner. But you're different, Julia. You've faced hardship and emerged stronger. That's why I trust you with this vineyard. It needs someone who understands the value of hard work and integrity. Whatever challenges come your way, remember this. You are capable of far more than you realize. Sincerely, Richard Carmichael." Julia's hands trembled as she set the letter down. Richard's words were both a comfort and a challenge. He believed in her, even when she doubted herself. The turning point. With Richard's encouragement fresh in her mind, Julia decided to take the fight to Eric. She worked closely with Clara to prepare for the mediation meeting, determined to show Eric that she wouldn't back down. The meeting took place in a sleek office building downtown. Eric sat across the table from Julia, his expression smug. Clara and Eric's lawyer exchanged legal jargon, but Julia kept her focus on Eric. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him directly. "You don't care about the vineyard. You never did." Eric's smirk faltered. "It's not about the vineyard," he admitted. "It's about winning." Julia shook her head. "You've already lost, Eric. This isn't about you. It's about Richard's legacy, and I won't let you destroy it." The room fell silent. Even Eric's lawyer seemed taken aback by her conviction. Clara leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Ms. Carmichael has made her position clear. If you wish to pursue this in court, be prepared for a lengthy and public battle. I'm confident the court will uphold the terms of Richard's will." Eric glared at Julia, his jaw tightening. For the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The tides shift. The mediation ended without a resolution, but Julia walked out with her head held high. Over the next few weeks, she continued to focus on the vineyard, strengthening its operations and deepening her relationships with the workers and the community. The legal battle never materialized. Perhaps Eric realized he couldn't win, or perhaps he simply grew tired of the fight. Whatever the reason, he faded from the picture, leaving Julia to focus on what truly mattered. A new chapter. Standing on the balcony of the main house one evening, Julia watched the sun set over the vineyard. The rows of grapevines stretched out before her, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The vineyard was thriving, and so was she. For the first time in years, Julia felt a sense of peace. She had faced betrayal, hardship, and doubt, but she had emerged stronger. The vineyard wasn't just a gift from Richard. It was a symbol of her resilience, and a legacy she was determined to protect. The legacy fulfilled. The vineyard buzzed with life, a chorus of activity that reflected its growing prosperity. Trucks carrying crates of wine rolled down the gravel drive, while workers moved among the vines, tending to the next season's crop. Julia stood at the edge of the fields, the warm sunlight on her face, taking it all in. She had fought tooth and nail to protect the vineyard, and now it felt as if the land itself was rewarding her. But the journey was far from over. While Eric had receded into the background, his shadow lingered. Julia knew she had to ensure the vineyard's future was secure, not just for herself, but for the workers who had become like family. The surprise audit. One morning, as Julia was reviewing the vineyard's quarterly earnings, Henry entered the study, his expression troubled. He carried a letter bearing the Carmichael family crest. "This just came in," he said, handing it to her. Julia unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the text. It was from the Carmichael Family Board, a seldom-invoked council made up of distant relatives and stakeholders who oversaw certain aspects of the family's assets. The letter demanded an audit of the vineyard's finances and operations, citing concerns over recent management changes. Julia set the letter down with a heavy sigh. "This has Eric's fingerprints all over it." Henry nodded grimly. "He's trying to undermine you, even from a distance." Julia clenched her fists. "Let them come. We've worked too hard to let this derail us." Preparing for battle. The days leading up to the audit were a whirlwind of preparation. Julia worked tirelessly with Henry and Clara to ensure every document, ledger, and operational record was in order. She reached out to distributors, local businesses, and even the vineyard's workers to gather testimonials about the vineyard's progress under her leadership. Clara was a steady presence throughout. "Audits like these are often just fishing expeditions," she reassured Julia. "They're hoping to find a crack they can exploit. But as long as you've been honest and thorough, they won't have a leg to stand on." Julia's confidence grew with Clara's support, but a nagging doubt remained. The Carmichael family had resources and influence she could scarcely imagine. She couldn't afford to make a single misstep. The day of reckoning. The auditors arrived on a gray morning, their suits as stiff and formal as their expressions. They wasted no time in combing through the vineyard's records, their questions pointed, and often laced with skepticism. Julia stayed calm, answering each inquiry with patience and clarity. Midway through the day, one of the auditors, a woman named Evelyn, pulled Julia aside. "I must say, Miss Carmichael, I'm impressed with what you've done here. The vineyard's operations are far more efficient than they were under previous management." Julia blinked, taken aback. "Thank you. That means a lot." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Not everyone in the Carmichael family agrees with me, but Richard was right to entrust this place to you. He always had an eye for potential." The comment bolstered Julia's resolve. By the end of the day, the auditors left with no findings of wrongdoing or mismanagement. Julia felt a wave of relief as she watched their cars disappear down the drive. Turning the tide. The audit's clean outcome was a turning point. The Carmichael Family Board, begrudgingly or not, acknowledged her legitimacy as the vineyard's owner. Eric's attempts to sabotage her had lost their momentum, and for the first time, Julia felt as if the vineyard was truly hers. Word of the vineyard's success continued to spread. New distributors reached out, eager to partner with her, and sales soared. Julia even began receiving invitations to high-profile wine events, opportunities to showcase the vineyard's legacy on a grand stage. A visit from the past. One afternoon, as Julia was walking the rows of vines, she spotted an unexpected visitor near the main house. Eric stood by his car, his posture less confident than usual. For a moment, Julia considered ignoring him, but curiosity got the better of her. "What are you doing here, Eric?" she asked, her tone cool. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I came to apologize." Julia raised an eyebrow. "That's new." Eric sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking a lot about what I've done. To you, to the vineyard, to my father's legacy. I let my greed get in the way of what really matters." Julia crossed her arms, skeptical. "And what brought on this sudden change of heart?" "I saw what you've done here," Eric said, gesturing toward the vineyard. "It's thriving because of you. I couldn't see it before, but my father was right. You were always the better choice." His words stirred a mix of emotions in Julia: vindication, anger, and a touch of pity. "What do you want, Eric?" "Nothing," he said, surprising her. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." Julia studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Apology accepted, but don't think that changes anything." Eric smiled faintly. "I wouldn't expect it to." As he drove away, Julia felt a weight lift from her chest. She didn't trust Eric, but his apology marked the end of a chapter she had long wanted to close. The Vineyard Gala. Months later, the vineyard hosted its first gala under Julia's leadership. The event was a celebration of its legacy and its bright future. Guests from across the wine industry attended, mingling among the rows of grapevines illuminated by twinkling lights. Julia stood near the main house, a glass of wine in hand, as she watched the festivities. Henry approached, a rare smile on his face. "You've done good, Julia," he said. "Richard would be proud." Julia's chest tightened with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you, and everyone here." Henry nodded. "This place is special. You've made it even more so." As the night wore on, Julia reflected on how far she had come. She had faced betrayal, doubt, and immense pressure, but she had emerged stronger. The vineyard wasn't just a legacy. It was a testament to her resilience and determination. A new beginning. The next morning, as the sun rose over the vineyard, Julia stood on the porch of the main house, gazing out at the rolling hills. The land was alive with possibility, and so was she. Richard had left her more than just a vineyard. He had given her a chance to rebuild her life, to prove her worth, and to create something lasting. And for the first time in years, Julia felt truly at peace. The vineyard's future was bright, and so was hers. She had weathered the storms and come out stronger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she was ready.